Facebook. Thank you all for joining. We'll just begin shortly. Just begin another minute or so. All right. I think we'll get going. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ISGAP Holocaust and Literature series. Today, we have with us Joanna Gilbert, an author, educator, and a public speaker. Throughout her life, Joanna has been haunted by the often heard refrain, "They went silently like sheep to the slaughter." Following her 2010 retirement from a 45-year career in education, Joanna has been dedicated to finding and celebrating the truth of Jewish heroism during the Shoah. The inspiring results of her mission form the basis of her work. True stories of the heroic Jews who actively and successfully defied the Nazis and their collaborators. Her book, Women of Valor, Polish Jewish Resistors to the Third Reich, published in 2014, presents 4 compelling first-person narratives of women who resisted and survived the Holocaust. Her second book, A Victory for Miriam, the little Jewish girl who defied the Nazis, was published in 2019. It is the true story of Miriam Birsk, who, as a young child, lived outdoors with the anti-Nazi combat partisans in the brutal forest of Belarus. Both the books continue to receive outstanding reviews. She is currently working on her third book, Women of Valor, French Resistors to the Third Reich, which is slated to hit the shelves next year. Welcome, Joanna. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Mihak. It's an honor to be here. I'm very grateful to you and to ISGAP for inviting me to join this outstanding program of speakers. Today, I'm going to present a pragmatic approach to using literature in Holocaust education. I've created a lesson about 3 girls, one fictional, one diarist, and one memoirist, to show the Holocaust from the perspective of 3 13-year-old girls. There are many controversies about using literature in Holocaust education, and we can talk about them in the question and the answer period. I'm just going to focus on something that is easy for teachers to implement today. There are many, but 4 in particular, benefits of using literature in Holocaust education. Those of us who are first wave baby boomers, born from about 1946 to 1950, didn't have the benefits of Holocaust education. What we did have were 2 books, remarkable books, The Diary of Anne Frank and Night, Elie Wiesel's Night, And both of those focused on the horror and the death and the victimization of Jews, in addition to the heroism. When I was growing up, I wondered why we were all victims. When you bring literature into Holocaust education, whether it's memoir or novel, short stories, these bring historic facts to life. It allows readers to connect personally with characters. It engenders an awareness of the cause and the effects of anti-Semitism. And while it's important to study anti-Semitism in and of itself with just the facts and the history, seeing the human impact of anti-Semitism is most effective when it is organically experienced by the readers. Furthermore, bringing literature into Holocaust education stimulates curiosity and further research about individual and historic context. There are many strategies for incorporating literature into Holocaust education. I'm going to focus on 4. 1, it's important right from the beginning to engage the students emotionally, to provide a personal connection to the Holocaust. 2, it's important to incorporate the theme that you have chosen via literary devices. I'm going to highlight 2 of those, metaphor and compare and contrast. The importance of this is kind of bureaucratic. If a teacher is going to incorporate something that's not part of the natural curriculum approved by their district, their state, and what other agencies, they have to be able to use items that meet the standards of their governing agencies. And so we try to hit all of those points, learning about metaphor and compare and contrast in the context of Holocaust education is a very effective way to do that. It's also important to engage students actively. This can be done through the use of graphic organizers, and it also can be done by creating a dramatic piece from the material that's in the literature. And finally, it's important to relate all context, all images to the overall theme. This would be throughout the lesson, building to the conclusion where you bring the theme up to date with a current event. So now, let's move on to the sample lesson. And please note that since I'm presenting this as an overview rather than as a teacher in the classroom, my pacing will be brisker than it would be if I were working with students, having discussions, and having them take notes. Let's think about the word flame, the flame of a candle. Let's think about it as a metaphor in terms of who has been a candlelight for you, who has brought love, inspiration, hope, information, who in some way has enlightened you throughout your life, who has been like a candle flame for you. In this case, we're using simile. And then look back on your life and think about for whom have you been like a candle flame, providing love, hope, enlightenment, safety, inspiration. For me, the major light in my life was my grandmother, who lived to 103. She was born in Vilna, Lithuania, which, depending on the day, was either in Russia, the Soviet Union, Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. It often changed. And she was very fortunate that she was able to leave Vilna well in advance of the German occupation. She came with the influx of immigrants to the United States in the early 1900s. They were getting away from the pogroms that were so common in areas where there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Because she came of her own free will, she wasn't fleeing per se, she was able to bring treasures from her family. And if you look at the photo image on the left, you'll see her brass candlesticks, which I used to watch her light on Friday nights. She brought those with her from Vilna, and they've always had a place in my home. Next to the candlesticks is an engagement photo of my grandmother and my grandfather. And if you can take a look, you'll see the beautiful clothes they're wearing. Typical of Jewish women in Eastern European countries during that time, my grandmother was an expert seamstress, and she made everything that she and my grandfather wore. Again, as part of the first wave of baby boomers after World War II, I was very fortunate to have a grandmother because growing up in a Jewish community outside of Detroit, most of my friends did not have grandparents. Those who did have grandparents were two kinds. They either talked about their experiences or they didn't. Instead of snuggling up with my grandmother to listen to fairy tales or picture books, I would snuggle up with her and listen to her stories of the real monsters, the real victims, and the real heroes of our family's history. She showed me their pictures, and I wanted to step inside them and know those people. And I always asked her, where are they? Why don't we have any other relatives? And she always said, Hitler got them, which I didn't understand until I was a little bit older. My grandmother was eventually able to come to Detroit, and she shared those stories with me all of her long life. My favorite was of her sister Rivka, her baby sister, who my grandmother always said I reminded her of. And so I grew up feeling as if I were living the life that Rivka didn't have a chance to live. And when I looked at that picture, I wished I could have known her and put that hat on my head and ruffled my fingers through the fur on her coat. She was a lively, active elementary school teacher who loved to sing and loved to dance. And I know when my grandmother looked at me, she was also seeing the face of her precious baby sister. It was strange being an early baby boomer in this country because as Americans, we had all the regular things that American kids had in the 50s. We had sugar frosted flakes and Tony the Tiger. What could be more cheerful? We had Howdy Doody. We had hula hoops. We had, of course, Mickey Mouse Club. All of this is cheery 1950s Americana that we baby boomers in general shared. And it influenced our personal zeitgeist. It influenced our lenses of how we saw things, of how we heard and experienced the history of our families. We had atomic bomb drills where we had to squeeze under our tables if we were little and go out into the hall and duck and cover. So while we were hearing stories in our Jewish community from survivors who did talk about it, we were very aware that it could happen again because we were living in an atomic age and we had many enemies in the Cold War. But we also had a president that we loved, respected, and felt safe with. It's been a long time since we had the feelings that we had about Eisenhower. We also had Anne Frank, the precious little Jewish girl who had to hide in an attic for 2 years, eventually was denounced and captured, and died a horrible death in concentration camp. And we had the intergenerational stories of survivors who had begun new families in a new country. We didn't have Holocaust education. We lived Holocaust education. Because of that, once I retired from classroom teaching, I decided I would try to find out the truth about Jewish Holocaust history. Did the Jews really go silently like sheep to the slaughter, as we had been told repeatedly? Did they fight fiercely? I was particularly interested in the role of women in anti-Nazi resistance. I couldn't believe that the women didn't fight. And as Mihak mentioned, I was able to research, travel, do interviews with elderly women in their 90s and older who actively resisted the Nazis and their willing collaborators during what became known later as the Holocaust. If you look at the first book, Women of Valor, Polish-Jewish Resistors to the Third Reich, the second edition in 2018, you'll see the third image is of a little girl with a huge bow on her head, which was the style then. That was Miriam Brisk. And as we worked on the book, I said, we all know about Anne Frank, we all know about death, but we don't know about a little Jewish girl who actually fought, who actually survived, and who went on to live a long, loving, and productive life. And as we talked, we realized we needed to do that book. And so it tells the other side of the story. A Victory for Miriam tells the story of a little Jewish girl who did defy the Third Reich. A little note about this cover. When my granddaughter, who's now all grown up, was 12, and we were working on the book, and I talked to her about everything so that I would know how a 12-year-old would respond, I felt frustrated that I didn't have a cover. And my granddaughter left the room and came back in a half an hour, and she had made a sketch of a little girl whose hair had been cut short, so she'd look like a boy, just like Miriam, fighting the symbol of the Third Reich. I, of course, was touched that through me, Miriam's story had touched my granddaughter so profoundly. We then, of course, turned the sketch over to a professional to make this lovely cover. And as Mihak mentioned, my next book about the French resistance to the Third Reich will be out next year. And now to the sample lesson, lighting the way, using candlelight, flame as a light to bring hope, to bring information, to bring enlightenment, inspiration to others. We're, of course, going to start with Anne Frank, who never dreamed when she was writing in her diary that all these years later, the world would still carry her in their heart, that she would have continued to bring a flame and a light to all of us. The genre that we study with Anne Frank is diary, nonfiction diary. And there are, of course, many movies and plays and graphic novels that also tell her story. We then go to absolute fiction. In The Devil's Arithmetic, the main character, Hannah Stern, who time travels back to concentration camp and experiences the horrors there. It is fiction, and there is a movie. And then, of course, we come to Miriam Miasnik-Brisk, whose book is memoir, narrative nonfiction. When we do the lesson, I ask the students to just look at the titles before they've even seen the books. Look at the title, The Devil's Arithmetic. What does that mean to you? The word devil, the word arithmetic, the two words together. And we would have a class discussion about what that title might mean and predict from that what the book might be about. We do the same thing with the Diary of a Young Girl. And we also have discussions so that the kids are actively involved. And the same with A Victory for Miriam. What does the word victory mean? What do you think Miriam means? What do you already know about these words that might affect what you think is going to happen? We then do the same thing with the covers. Students are asked to look closely at the cover. For this one, look at the girl in the foreground who seems to be vaporizing. The people on the other side in color. What does this say to a student? What is the perspective they might glean from this? Well, it is fiction, it is a novel, and there is a movie. After they have read the book, there are post-reading questions. The first, at the beginning, in what way was Hannah in the dark about the Holocaust? She was a modern day American kid who was kind of put out that she had to observe her family's Passover celebration. She was a little bit self-centered. And when she opened the door on Passover, instead of finding a visitor, she found herself time traveling. She became Chaya. And in what way did Chaya become a light for Hannah? How do you think Hannah, once she comes back to modern day, will become a light for others? We look at the cover of A Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank's diary. We note the nonfiction diary, graphic novels, movies, and plays. The students then read it either as a class or in groups, and afterwards they have similar post-reading questions. In what way was Anne metaphorically in the dark at the beginning of the book when she had a lovely, wonderful, lively, normal childhood in Germany before moving to Amsterdam? In what way was she literally in the dark after the German occupation? What became light for her in that dark attic? And in what ways has Anne become a light for the world? Again, similar for A Victory for Miriam. What was she in the dark about as a little girl in Warsaw, upper middle class? Father was a surgeon. Life was sweet. Life was full of light, but she was truly in the dark about what was about to happen. In what ways did she become a light for others during the occupation? A little girl, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. How could she be a light? But she was. And in what ways has Miriam become a light for the world in growing up and becoming a scientist, a medical school professor, a loving wife, a loving mother, an author, a poet, an artist, a public speaker? Miriam shows the other part of Jewish Holocaust history. We were not all victims, and we definitely were fierce fighters. In terms of getting the students actively engaged, one way that's very effective is graphic organizers. And I know this is very busy in a Zoom, so I'll just give you an overview. This is a Venn diagram named after Mr. Venn, who created it. And we have separated the characters. They each have their own bubble. We have Hannah Chaya with fiction novel. We have Miriam with memoir, narrative nonfiction. We have Anne with diary nonfiction. And we can see in each bubble the individual characteristics of each character. And then we can see where they overlap with each other. And in the center, you can see what all three of these 13-year-old girls had in common. This allows the students to dive deeply into the material while they're utilizing literary devices and graphic organizers. They're learning without even realizing it. This also provides them with the information and the organizational strategies to write an essay at the end of the unit. Another way to use an activity to actively engage students is to take the material from a book and turn it into a dramatic theater piece. I apologize for the quality of these photos. Here we have Manya, one of the women featured in my first book, Holocaust survivor, who participated in a program called Detroit Witness Theater, where a survivor is adopted by two students who spend time every week for a semester discussing the survivor's history, creating a story from it, and then turning it into a theatrical piece in which the students and their survivors, excuse me, perform in front of the public audience. 1 minute. These two students, you can see, I think, how they were impacted by their relationship with Manya. They remained close as grandchildren to her for the next 2 years when she passed away in 2015. Another theatrical piece, something that can be done in even middle school classrooms, is to have the Holocaust survivors from a book, let's say a Women of Valor book, sitting in the shadows behind a table upon which are different kinds of candles, and in front of which are strange looking piles. At some point, the spotlight comes on, and the first woman, in this case Manya, will stand up in the spotlight and she will talk about her candles, her Shabbos candles, and the last time she and her mother lit Shabbos candles before she had to run with her father and sister to the forest, never seeing her family again. As Manya begins her story, something starts to happen to that pile in front of her on the floor. It is a pile of rags, and from it begins to emerge a younger Manya, a Manya who's ready to fight. And this younger version takes up the story, and she talks about what she's wearing and how she didn't get a chance to change clothes for 18 months. And what she was wearing was a tattered accumulation of rags. Therefore, the mysterious pile in front of the table in her spot is a pile of rags. It's rags that are attached to a costume, and another student would be crouched down, so they look like a pile of rags, and then as they have the spotlight, they emerge to continue the story. When they're part of the story, in this case, her time with the partisans is ended, she then goes back down into the pile, and the kids, being kids, they can sneak under the table and go behind the seated survivor actors and be in the background kind of as a memory. After each of the characters has done her, the two monologues, you then see them again in the shadows, but all of their candles, whether it's a Hanukkah, a Yahrzeit candle, or a birthday cake, are clearly visible, as are their piles. In one case, a fur coat. In another case, it could be, let's see, a leopard skin coat. Each of the piles in front are symbolic of what is in the story. And now, we've had examples that show different literary forms. We have shown the impact of anti-Semitism without even actually saying the word. Students are absorbing it. It's important to find out what lessons did these young women the characters in the book learn about light? What lessons did you, the students, the audience, learn about light? Your light and the light of others. And most important, how will you share your lesson and your light with others? The point of sharing these stories is so there will be other witnesses to carry on the legacy of the heroes, the heroines of the Holocaust. To bring it up to date, we have Amanda Gorman, who was the National Youth Poet Laureate and spoke at the inauguration of President Joe Biden. She grew up in an impoverished home and had severe auditory processing problems. If you saw her, you saw magic. She herself was light. And her poem that she spoke on this occasion was focused on light as well. From the hill we climb. For there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it. If only we are brave enough to be it. And now I hope from the presentation, you have been enlightened and will now carry on and be the light yourself. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Joanna. That was incredible.
Okay. Just a minute while I try to do this tech. All right. Hi there.
Yeah, you can go ahead and stop sharing as well.
Talk sharing.
Yeah, you can stop the sharing because we can see your desktop.
Ah, okay. Good thing I cleaned it up, huh?
We could have a sneak peek to your next book.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble doing this. Stop video. I don't want to do that. All right, are you still seeing my desktop?
Yep.
Okay, well, let's just move on. We'll move that to the side. And let's see if we have any questions or comments.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. Let's see if I can answer them.
So I just loved how the way you took up the imagery of the flame, because flame, I'm very curious about the origins of the terms. And as I could see that it rose from the Latin word flammula, which means to shine. And it has so many other connotations.
Yeah.
And I also loved how you played with the imagery of light and dark. And as we say, it's all the thing is all about from darkness to moving on to light. So we do have I really liked all of that, and I was fascinated. But before we begin with the questions, just a curious question: that which age group would you recommend?
These
Because
particular lessons are completely adaptable at the discretion of a teacher. I have done sixth grade in a Lutheran school, and it was completely adaptable to be understood and engaging at their level. It's also been done at the high school level. I've done a similar presentation at university level in a Holocaust studies program. So the beauty is that they're absolutely flexible and they incorporate history as part of a conversation. You don't realize you're learning. It's just absorbing, just as we do on the phone or in any other interaction. So they are absolutely flexible. And I want to give a shout out to the many other outstanding programs there are, which also use literature. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, Echoes and Reflection, Facing History and Ourselves, Teaching the Shoah. There are now many outstanding Holocaust education programs that use literature and can be adapted for a semester or for a week. Mine in particular focuses specifically on disabusing people of the notion that the Jews, particularly the women, went silently like sheep to the slaughter.
Great. We have a question from Judy. Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
You're muted.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out the right button. Sorry.
Oh, hi.
That was great and really very thought-provoking. You know, I'm not a teacher, and so you gave me a very different perspective. I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, when you talked about the cover images of, there was one book with a green cover and a girl stepping out.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have known how to interpret that. I still don't know how to interpret that. Now, maybe that's because I didn't read the book, but how do you bring about that discussion?
In a classroom with an exercise like that, they haven't read the book yet either. And so it's a guided brainstorm where the teacher will guide the students to look at different things. But before the guiding, the students would all be asked, what's your first impression? What do you think? Is it good art? Do you like the colors? Just basic things. And then after that brainstorming segment has happened and the students bring their own knowledge and perspective to it, then the teacher can start guiding. Well, did you notice that that girl who looks modern, she's wearing modern clothes, seems to be evaporating? What are the expressions on the faces? So anything that the kids might not have already brought up, the teacher then can lead them to bring up.
Okay. The other thing I was particularly curious about is your Venn diagram.
Okay.
And do you again, I thought that was a very interesting approach. And do you have the students fill in?
Yeah, that works particularly well in partners. Sometimes with groups, there's just so much information, the kids go down rabbit holes. But this is a particularly good exercise for partners to do. And the teacher can hand out, well, it can be done on a computer now or on a piece of paper, a handout where the bubbles are already there. And then the students discuss with each other and fill in the elements. Then they come together as a class and they can share what each partnership has come up with until there's a consensus of some sort. It's very, very effective, as I mentioned, in prepping the students for writing an essay, especially when there's 3 characters. It just lends itself to a 5-paragraph essay. And the kids who might not have had a clue how to start it, they already have the theme, they already have a paragraph for each of the characters, and they already have supporting evidence, details, and examples. So it's a wonderful way to begin 5-paragraph essay writing.
Well, you're clearly an experienced teacher, and I'm not. That's great. I guess the last thing that really struck me was your discussion of talking about how these women became light in their lives. Anyway, thank you very much, and I loved your books. So
thank you, Judy. I wanted to give Judy a shout out. Maybe if you'll put in the chat the title of your wonderful book on your family's history with the Holocaust. I think it would be well worth sharing with other people. Judy is a retired physician of infectious diseases and an expert in many, many areas. And her book is an important one. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Judy. Anybody else from the audience would go ahead and unmute yourself. Feel free to ask any question. So while they are at it, okay, thanks, Judy.
Thanks.
So, Joanne, what role did gender play um, during all of this struggle and resilience? Was it, advantageous, or at some point was it detrimental for their lives?
Both. And it's such an important point that so many people haven't had a chance to really think about yet. And gender was very important because girls, if they had blonde hair or red hair, could very often pass as Gentile and become spies and couriers. They could hide documents in a baby carriage, for instance, in a baby's diapers. They had some freedom, not real freedom, but they had more freedom to disguise themselves. They also had vulnerabilities because they were targets for rape. And so that was difficult. Another difficulty was if they were in religious Jewish families, they were brought up to be obedient, to respect authority, to stay home and learn how to be mothers and wives. They weren't brought up to run off to the forest and learn how to use a gun or to do surgery in a swamp clinic. It's completely different. Boys might have been brought up more athletically. They might have had more camping experience, but if they were Jewish boys, because of circumcision, they were always in danger of being captured and executed. Also, if they were seen after a year or two, if a male were seen on the streets, he was liable for being picked up because he either should have been in a camp or in the military. So just his very existence as a male put him in danger.
Great. And I also know about the role of cashariots, the courier girls. And I think it was because of the same reason that girls were chosen as cashariots, because they could hide their appearances under a makeup or conceal their identities, whereas it was not so with the males. They were.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was interesting because they didn't have a women's lib movement. No one thought girls could do anything. So sometimes that was an advantage because a German would look at a little blonde Jewish girl with pigtails and would never dream because she was a girl. What could she do? That she was a courier carrying important documents from one partisan group to another through the forest. The couriers were extraordinary, and a couple of the women in my books were in fact couriers.
Wow. So, Joanne, this is just a personal curiosity.
Yeah.
That was there something in particular about these three ladies that you chose? The reason
Yes.
behind the choice?
Yeah. The three in the sample lesson, or the women in my books?
The women in your books.
Okay, so the four women in my first book, I wish I could say there were some stellar reason I chose them. I began by saying, I don't have a PhD. Who's even going to talk to me? And so I sent out emails everywhere, community centers, synagogues, every agency I could think of where they spoke English. And I didn't think anyone would respond. And then they did. And then I spoke to, I can't tell you how many people trying to get the right focus. I wanted women who had distinctly different experiences, who were all young teenagers, or in Miriam's case, a little girl. Again, they had to speak English. I wasn't in a position to pay a translator. And at that point, I was just beginning. So it was very helpful if I could find people who lived in places I might be traveling to, such as Michigan. And so two of my women were residing in Michigan, and one, Faye Shulman, was in Toronto. And so for those three women, it was easy for me to get to them, and I had free places to stay. For Lola, who was a brilliant artist and forger, passed as Gentile, and actually met Eichmann in his office. She was the sister of my first personal history client, Ben Lesser, who was the first Holocaust survivor that I worked with to create a book. His book, Living a Life That Matters, From Nazi Nightmare to American Dream, came out in 2012. And Lola was his sister. And when he was telling me his story, I was thinking, all my life, I have wanted to find a Jewish woman who fought. And here she is. And so as soon as Ben and I wrapped, I said, do you think your sister would talk to me? And he said, oh yeah, I've been telling her all about your work. And so we arranged for me to go to Borough Park, which is kind of a throwback to the 1700s in Brooklyn. And I spent a weekend with Lola taking care of me. She was wonderful. And if I weren't careful, she'd interview me. And I'd end up talking. So that's how I got those 4 women. Miriam for the second book, of course, was one of them. And the women for my French resistors, through various contacts that I made from my first 2 books, I was able to connect with women who had been leaders in the Jewish French resistance. They agreed to communicate with me, and then I was able to, meet with them in Paris on several occasions. They were quite elderly, very fierce to that moment, and I was honored to make a presentation about what I was working on to women of Jewish resistance at the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris.
Wow. That's fascinating journey.
Oh,
So as these women are women of valor, so was there anything that triggered them, which made them kind of more resilient, and they swear to just go on despite everything? So was there any trigger event for them?
It's such an interesting thing to look into because they were all just regular girls doing regular girl things. The young teenagers were hanging out with their friends. They couldn't go to public school anymore as Jewish girls. So they would hang out and play cards, and they loved American movie magazines. And they loved gossip, and they would do each other's nails, and they were silly, normal girls. And then something happened to each of them. In Miriam's case, it was the Blitz. Their beautiful upper middle class apartment building was bombed, and they had to go into bomb shelters, and she was a little girl. They ended up escaping and then being put in a ghetto. She had no choice in the matter. In the middle of one night, her family escaped from the ghetto to the forest and joined a band of partisans. The partisans never wanted to take women unless they wanted to use them, and they for sure would never take a little girl. But Miriam had an ace in the hole. Her father was a renowned surgeon, and the partisans wanted him. And so they took all 3, and Miriam stopped being a little girl. She had responsibilities to help boil water for surgical instruments, find wood for the fires. She climbed trees to spot maybe their Germans are coming or collaborators. She had adult responsibilities. So she wasn't triggered internally. She was just going with what she had to do. With Manya, they were already in the ghetto. Her father had been planning to escape, and he took his 2 daughters, his 2 young teenage daughters, with him. Manya never forgot her mom's face and the face of the 2 little sisters as they waved goodbye that night, never to be seen again. Manya, of course, was a terrified young teenager. She didn't have any skills. But she had vengeance, and vengeance is one of the characteristics that the other 2 shared. If nothing else, they were going to avenge the deaths of their loved ones. Now, Manya could not pass as Gentile, but she was able to pass as she put it, a crazy Polish girl. And at one point, she was hiding in a deserted house when some German military came, and she knew they were going to kill her. She already looked horrible. There was no beauty going on, but she made herself look crazy wild. And because she was multilingual, which was one of the skills they all shared, the multilingual and the ability to interact with other cultures, she was able to make the Germans believe she was just this crazy, stupid Polish girl, which they already believed, so it wasn't hard. And they opened up their knapsacks and shared their food with her. And she hadn't really eaten much but subsistence in months. She realized later that they weren't Nazis per se. They were German men and boys who had been drafted. So again, she learned how to fight. She learned how to shoot. She learned how to blow up bridges. She learned how to be fierce because she was motivated by vengeance. And similar with the others.
Wow. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So before we wrap up, just a quick question. During your interviews with them, we often come across, when we read the female experiences, we often come across how the bond of solidarity was very important in the concentration camps, especially among the female prisoners.
Mhm.
So they formed foster families and bonds of solidarities, when one would cook, the other would keep guard. So do we find similar sort of thing with these people as well? Because apart from their resilient personalities, they also have a very soft personality, soft side to their personality.
Yeah, they had to get rid of that soft side because they were fighters and killers when they had to be. It was different than in the camps because these women were on the move and you never knew from one day to the next who you were going to be with. One thing that was fairly true for the women in the partisans would be that they would come under the protection of a man, perhaps an officer. And while they didn't talk about the intimate details, it was like being married. And that was to keep other men away from them. And so that was very, very common. So they had to defy so many things. They had to defy the way they were brought up. They also had to defy their own sense of morality. Jewish kids are not necessarily brought up to steal and to lie and to shoot and to kill and to blow up bridges. And so when you mentioned their resilience, I think part of what these women shared was they were adaptable. They had a fierceness that they didn't know they had. And they learned really fast. They were determined to avenge. They didn't care about living or dying anymore. Now, one of the women, Faye, actually did take in a foster girl who had been abandoned, and she had to fight the other partisans to do it because the last thing they needed was some other girl with the fighting partisans. And she did take her under her wing, and she managed to get her on an airplane from Moscow because the partisans were Soviet former prisoners of war who had escaped. They were in touch with Moscow, and Moscow was sending supplies, and they would land sometimes on a frozen lake. And Faye was able to get this little girl on one of those planes going back to Moscow. So there was some bonding, but very, very minimal.
Wow. Thank you, Joanna, so much.
Thank you. Thank
Such an
you.
engaging presentation and followed by an equally engaging discussion.
Thank you. I hope that bringing literature into Holocaust education is seen as valid, even though it's not just the facts. It is the heart and the soul of our history. And I hope that our viewers will take that with them. Thank you so much.
And I would end this by using the catchphrase that is used for your book, and that Joanna's books will inform your minds, lift your spirits, and warm your hearts. Thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us. And thank you so much, audience, for joining us. And do join us back on 4th of March. And we'll have Professor Alexander Zaproder with us, and she'll be speaking about salvaged pages. Some of you might know her. To others, she might be new. So do join us again on the 4th of next month. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Joanna.
Bye-bye.